The evening crowd slowly filled the restaurant as the sun disappeared behind tall buildings across the street. Warm lights glowed through the windows, and the quiet sound of conversations mixed with the clinking of plates and glasses. It was one of those places where business people often stopped after work. Some came to relax. Others came to talk about deals and plans. At one corner table near the large front window, several well-dressed people were already seated. Their voices were louder than the others around them, and the way they carried themselves made it clear they were used to being noticed. At the center of the group sat a man who was clearly the leader. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive without trying too hard. His watch reflected the light every time he moved his hand. His posture was confident, almost sharp, like someone who was always thinking 2 steps ahead. People in the restaurant didn't know his full story, but many recognized him from business news and magazines. He was the head of a large company that had grown very quickly over the past few years. In the business world, his name was often connected with bold decisions and strong leadership. But the people who worked closely with him knew something else too. He had very little patience for mistakes. At the table, he spoke while the others listened carefully. A few laughed at his jokes, even when they were not especially funny. It was clear that his opinion carried weight. While the group talked, a young waitress moved between tables nearby, taking orders and delivering drinks. She worked quietly and efficiently, making sure each guest felt comfortable. She was not loud, and she did not try to draw attention to herself. But she noticed many things. She noticed when a guest needed more water before they asked. She noticed when a table was ready to order even before someone raised their hand. And she noticed details. When it was time to serve the corner table, she took a menu and walked over with calm steps. "Good evening," she said politely. "Welcome. Can I start you with something to drink?" The group paused their conversation for a moment. One of the people quickly ordered sparkling water. Another asked for coffee. Someone else requested tea. The waitress wrote everything down carefully. Then she turned her attention to the man in the center of the table. For a brief moment, her eyes rested on the leather briefcase placed beside his chair. It had a small metal plate with a familiar company symbol engraved on it. Most people would not look twice at something like that, but she did. She had seen that symbol before. The man noticed her glance and slightly raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" he asked in a calm but firm voice. The waitress hesitated for a second. She was not trying to interrupt or cause trouble, but something about the logo on the briefcase caught her attention. "Not wrong," she said gently. "I just noticed the design." One of the people at the table chuckled. "The design?" he repeated with a playful tone. The man in the center leaned back slightly in his chair. "What about it?" he asked. The waitress kept her voice respectful. "The line inside the symbol," she said. "Most versions of the logo curve a little differently. This one looks like an older style." For a moment there was silence. Then someone at the table laughed out loud. Another person smiled as if hearing something amusing. The CEO looked at the briefcase, then back at the waitress. "You're telling me about my own company's logo?" he said with a light laugh. His tone was not angry, but it carried a hint of disbelief. The people at the table laughed again. One of them said jokingly, "Maybe we should hire her for the design department." The CEO smiled slightly, enjoying the moment. "Well," he said, "that would be interesting." The waitress did not look embarrassed. She simply stood calmly with her small order notebook in her hand. "I'm sorry if it sounded strange," she said. "I just noticed it." Her voice remained steady. The CEO waved his hand slightly, as if brushing the comment aside. "No harm done," he said. "It's just funny hearing someone in a restaurant lecture me about a logo." Another round of quiet laughter moved around the table. But the waitress did not argue. Instead, she simply nodded. "I'll bring your drinks shortly," she said. She turned and walked back toward the service counter. At the table, the conversation quickly returned to business. They talked about market plans, upcoming meetings, and future investments. Words like growth, strategy, and expansion filled the air. Yet something small lingered in the CEO's mind. He glanced again at the briefcase beside his chair. For years he had seen that logo everywhere. On documents, on buildings, on company products. It was part of the identity he had helped build. Still, he dismissed the thought and focused back on the conversation. A few minutes later, the waitress returned carrying a tray with drinks. She placed each glass carefully in front of the guests. Sparkling water, coffee, tea, everything exactly as ordered. When she reached the CEO, she placed the glass gently on the table. "Here you go," she said. He looked at her for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue the earlier conversation. "So," he said casually, "you study logos in your spare time?" The people at the table smiled again, expecting another joke. But the waitress simply answered honestly. "I like learning about brands," she said. That response seemed to surprise him slightly. He expected her to laugh or apologize. Instead, she sounded calm and sincere. "Brands?" he repeated. "Yes," she said. "How companies present themselves, their designs, their messages." One of the colleagues leaned forward with curiosity. "That's interesting," he said. "Do you work in that field?" The waitress shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "Just something I like reading about." The CEO took a sip of his drink. Then he glanced once more at the briefcase. "All right," he said with a small smile. "Tell me something." The people at the table watched with amusement. "If you're such an expert," he continued lightly, "what exactly did you notice?" The waitress paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "The symbol," she said. "The inner line used to curve upward slightly more. In some older versions it was sharper. The newer design softened it." The CEO slowly raised an eyebrow. It was a very specific detail, one that most people would never think about. He leaned forward slightly. "You're pretty confident about that," he said. She nodded politely. "I've seen both versions before." Another quiet chuckle came from the table. But this time the CEO didn't laugh as quickly. Instead, he studied her expression. She did not look like someone guessing. She looked like someone who had actually noticed something. Still, he shook his head with a half smile. "Well," he said, "that's impressive observation for someone bringing coffee." The comment sounded playful, but it carried a small edge. The people at the table laughed again. The waitress simply gave a polite smile. Then she said something very simple. "Sometimes people notice things others overlook." For a brief moment, the CEO did not respond. Her tone was not rude. It was calm, almost thoughtful. The table grew quiet for a second before the conversation started again. The waitress stepped away and continued helping other guests across the room. But something about the moment stayed in the air. The CEO leaned back in his chair again, listening to his colleagues talk. Yet every now and then his eyes drifted toward the briefcase beside him. And for the first time that evening, he looked at the small company symbol on it a little more carefully. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet question had started to form. How did a waitress notice something like that? The restaurant continued to grow busier as the evening moved forward. More guests walked in, filling the remaining tables. The sound of soft music blended with quiet conversations and the occasional laugh. Plates moved in and out of the kitchen as servers carefully carried trays through the narrow spaces between tables. At the corner table, the group of business people was still deep in conversation. Documents were spread across the table, and a tablet screen showed charts and numbers. They were discussing plans for the next quarter, speaking about markets, partnerships, and upcoming investments. But the man at the center of the table was not as focused as before. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the leather briefcase resting beside his chair. The small metal plate on it carried the company symbol he had seen thousands of times. Normally, he would not even think about it. But now, the waitress's comment kept echoing in his mind. The inner line used to curve upward slightly more. He remembered the words clearly. He took another sip of his drink while pretending to listen to the conversation around him. One of his colleagues was explaining a new proposal, pointing at numbers on the screen. "If we move forward with the expansion now, the growth could double within 2 years," the colleague said confidently. The others nodded, discussing risks and benefits. But the CEO leaned slightly down and picked up his briefcase. He placed it gently on the table. "Give me a second," he said casually. No one questioned him. They assumed he was checking something related to the meeting. He looked closely at the metal logo. The design was simple but powerful. It had become one of the most recognized symbols in the industry. Still, he noticed the line inside it. He ran his finger lightly across the engraving. It looked exactly the same as always. At least that's what he thought. He leaned back again, slightly annoyed with himself. Why was he even thinking about this? It was just a comment from a waitress. Yet something about her confidence had been unusual. She did not sound like someone guessing. She spoke like someone who had studied it. Across the room, the waitress was helping another table. She carried a tray with 2 bowls of soup and placed them carefully in front of an elderly couple. She smiled politely and asked if they needed anything else. Then she walked toward the kitchen again. The CEO watched her for a moment without saying anything. One of his colleagues noticed. "You're unusually quiet tonight," the colleague said with a grin. The others looked up. "Thinking about the meeting tomorrow?" another asked. The CEO gave a small shrug. "Just thinking," he replied. The colleague leaned back in his chair. "About what?" The CEO hesitated for a second before answering. "That waitress," he said. The table went quiet for a moment before someone laughed. "The logo expert?" one of them joked. "Yes," the CEO said with a half-smile. Another colleague chuckled. "Well, maybe she's secretly running a branding agency in her spare time." More laughter spread around the table. But the CEO didn't laugh as much this time. "She sounded pretty sure about what she said," he added. One of the people at the table shook his head. "Come on," he said. "It was probably just a lucky guess. Or she read something online," another added. The CEO nodded slowly. "That's possible." But he still looked thoughtful. At that moment, the waitress returned with a plate of food for their table. She placed the dishes carefully in front of each guest, making sure everything was arranged properly. "Your meals," she said politely. The smell of fresh food filled the air. The CEO looked up at her again. "Can I ask you something?" he said. The people at the table looked at each other with amused expressions. The waitress paused. "Of course," she said. He tapped lightly on the briefcase. "You mentioned the logo earlier," he said. She nodded. "Yes. How exactly did you notice that detail?" She thought for a moment before answering. "I've seen your company's symbol in different places," she said. "On products, websites, and magazines." The CEO listened carefully. She continued speaking calmly. "A few years ago, I read an article about how brands sometimes update small parts of their design. They change tiny things so the logo looks more modern but still familiar." One of the colleagues leaned forward slightly. "That's actually true," he said quietly. The waitress continued. "I started paying attention after that," she said. "Sometimes companies change colors or shapes very slightly." The CEO studied her face. "And you noticed that with ours?" "Yes," she said simply. Another colleague raised his eyebrows. "That's impressive observation," he admitted. The CEO rested his elbow on the table. "You said this version looked older," he said. "Yes. How can you tell?" The waitress pointed gently toward the briefcase. "The line inside the symbol," she explained. "In newer versions, it's a little softer." She traced the shape lightly in the air with her finger. "Here it looks sharper." The CEO slowly looked down again at the briefcase. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he asked another question. "Did you study design?" The waitress shook her head. "Not exactly." "What do you mean?" She hesitated slightly, as if deciding how much to share. "I used to take business classes," she said quietly. "Used to?" the CEO asked. "Yes." "What happened?" She gave a small polite smile. "Life happened." The table became silent for a moment. Her answer was simple, but it carried meaning. The CEO looked at her more carefully now. "How long did you study?" he asked. "A couple of years," she replied. "And now you work here?" "Yes." She did not sound ashamed or unhappy. It was simply the reality of her life. The CEO nodded slowly. "That's interesting," he said. One of his colleagues smiled. "You might be talking to a future marketing expert," he joked. The waitress laughed softly. "I'm just someone who likes learning." The CEO looked thoughtful again. "Well," he said, "you definitely caught my attention." She gave a polite nod. "I'm glad." Another table signaled for assistance across the room. The waitress noticed and glanced in that direction. "I should get back to work," she said. "Of course," the CEO replied. She walked away again, moving quickly toward the other guests. The group at the corner table remained quiet for a few seconds. Finally, one colleague spoke. "You're really thinking about what she said, aren't you?" The CEO picked up his fork and looked down at his plate. "Maybe," he admitted. Another colleague laughed. "You've probably had thousands of designers working on that logo over the years." "That's true," the CEO said. "And now a waitress is giving design feedback." The table laughed again, but the CEO simply smiled. Then he looked down at the briefcase one more time. He suddenly remembered something. A few months earlier, his design team had discussed updating certain materials with a slightly revised logo. They wanted the inner line softened. It was supposed to be a small improvement most people wouldn't notice. The update had been approved, but not every item had been replaced yet. Some older materials still existed. Slowly, he leaned forward and looked closely at the metal engraving again. His eyes focused on the line inside the symbol. And for the first time that evening, he felt a small spark of curiosity growing stronger. Because if the waitress was right, then she had noticed something almost no one else would ever see. The conversation at the table slowly returned to business, but the man in the center was no longer fully part of it. His colleagues continued talking about expansion plans and financial projections, yet his attention kept drifting back to the same small thought. The logo. He placed his fork down and looked again at the briefcase beside him. The metal plate reflected the soft light from above. For years he had carried it everywhere without thinking about it. It was just another item among many things connected to his company. But now he looked at it more carefully. The waitress's words played again in his mind. The line inside the symbol used to curve differently. He leaned forward slightly and turned the briefcase so the logo faced him directly. The others at the table were busy discussing numbers on a tablet, so they didn't notice what he was doing. His eyes followed the shape of the symbol. At first it seemed completely normal. Then he remembered something. A meeting. It had happened several months earlier in a quiet conference room at the company headquarters. The design team had presented a small update to the brand identity. Nothing dramatic. Just a minor adjustment meant to make the logo feel more modern. Most people would never notice the difference. That was the whole idea. The designer had explained that even tiny changes could affect how people felt about a brand. The inner line would be slightly softer. The curve would be smoother. The CEO had approved the update without much thought. It seemed like a reasonable improvement. But the transition had not happened everywhere at the same time. Some materials were still using the older version. Slowly, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were several printed documents from the office. He flipped one page open. At the top corner of the paper was the company logo. He placed the paper next to the metal plate on the briefcase. For a moment, he simply stared at both versions. The difference was very small. So small that most people would miss it. But once he noticed it, he could clearly see the change. The line on the document was smoother. The line on the briefcase was sharper. The waitress had been right. He leaned back in his chair slowly. A quiet feeling of surprise spread across his face. One of his colleagues noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" the colleague asked. The CEO didn't answer immediately. He turned the paper toward the others. "Look at this," he said. The group leaned closer to see. "It's the logo," someone said. "Yes," the CEO replied. They looked confused. "So?" another asked. He pointed at the line inside the symbol. "Notice anything?" The colleagues studied it carefully. After a moment, one of them shrugged. "Looks the same to me." Another person leaned in closer. "Wait," he said slowly. The line here looks softer. He pointed at the printed document. Then he pointed at the briefcase. This one looks sharper. The table became quiet. That's the older version, the CEO said. Now the others understood. You mean the update the design team showed us? Someone asked. Yes. One colleague looked surprised. Did the waitress notice that? The CEO nodded slowly. She did. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then one of them let out a quiet laugh. That's actually impressive. Another shook his head. I've worked with this company for 5 years and I never noticed. The CEO closed the folder and placed it back inside the briefcase. His thoughts returned to the moment earlier that evening. The waitress had not guessed. She had seen the difference, and she had spoken about it with confidence. Across the restaurant, she was now helping another group of guests. She carried a tray of drinks and placed them carefully on a table near the wall. The CEO watched her for a moment. Earlier, he had laughed when she mentioned the logo. Now the situation felt different. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table. I want to ask her something else, he said. The colleagues exchanged curious looks. You're serious? One asked. Yes. At that moment, the waitress walked past their table again on her way to the kitchen. The CEO raised his hand slightly. Excuse me. She stopped and turned toward the table. Yes. Could you come here for a moment? She stepped closer, holding her small notebook in her hand. Is everything all right with the food? She asked politely. Yes, the CEO said. Everything is fine. He paused for a second. Then he turned the briefcase so the logo faced her again. You were right, he said. She looked slightly surprised. About what? She asked. The logo. He opened the folder again and placed the document beside the briefcase. The line is different. The waitress glanced at both versions. A small smile appeared on her face. I thought so, she said. The people at the table looked at each other, impressed. The CEO leaned forward slightly. How did you learn to notice something that small? She thought for a moment before answering. When I was studying business, she said. One of my teachers talked about branding a lot. He listened carefully. He said a good brand is like a story, she continued. Every small detail matters. She pointed lightly at the symbol. Lines, shapes, colors. They all send a message. The CEO nodded slowly. That's exactly what our designers say. She smiled politely. I guess I remembered the lesson. One of the colleagues spoke up. Do you still study these things? Whenever I can, she replied. Even while working here? Yes, she said. What makes you interested in it? She looked thoughtful for a moment. I like understanding how companies grow, she said. How they build something that people recognize and trust. The CEO folded his arms. That's not something most people think about while serving food. She gave a small laugh. Maybe not. Another colleague asked, Do you read business books? Sometimes, she said. Where do you find the time? She shrugged gently. Late at night. The table grew quiet again. There was something sincere about her answers. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply sharing something she cared about. The CEO looked down once more at the logo. Then he looked back at her. You know, he said slowly, most people in my office didn't notice this difference. She looked surprised. Really? Yes. The colleagues nodded in agreement. That's true, one of them said. The waitress looked at the symbol again. I guess when you look closely at something, small changes become easier to see. The CEO smiled slightly. That seems to be true. Another table across the room raised their hands to call for service. The waitress noticed and glanced toward them. I should help them, she said. Of course, the CEO replied. Before she left, he said one more thing. You have a sharp eye. She smiled. Thank you. Then she walked away again, disappearing into the busy movement of the restaurant. The CEO leaned back in his chair and watched her go. His colleagues were still discussing the surprising moment. I can't believe she caught that, one said. Neither can I, another added. The CEO remained quiet, because the situation had changed in his mind. Earlier that evening, He had seen her as just another waitress, someone passing by with menus and drinks. But now he saw something else. Someone who paid attention. Someone who noticed details others ignored. And suddenly, he realized that the most surprising part was not the logo itself. It was the person who had pointed it out. The restaurant was lively as the evening went on. Servers moved quickly between tables, carrying trays filled with plates and drinks. The quiet hum of conversations mixed with the occasional laughter and clinking of cutlery. The smell of freshly cooked food lingered in the air. For most people, it was just another busy night. But for the man in the corner, the night had become something more. After noticing the logo difference and realizing the waitress had been correct, he could not get the thought out of his mind. He kept glancing toward her as she moved from table to table, helping guests with a calm and efficient manner. Every time she smiled politely or placed a tray down carefully, it reminded him of the confidence she had shown earlier. The CEO's colleagues were talking quietly amongst themselves, but he was no longer focused on their conversation. He kept thinking about what he had just discovered. A simple comment from a young waitress had revealed something important that almost no one in his office had noticed. He found himself admiring her quiet confidence and attention to detail. Finally, he leaned forward and called her back to their table. She approached cautiously, holding her small notepad in her hand. She didn't know why he wanted to speak with her again, but she maintained a polite and professional demeanor. "Thank you for pointing out the logo earlier," he said, his voice serious this time, without the hint of humor he had used before. "You were right." The waitress paused for a moment, clearly surprised. She hadn't expected this level of recognition from someone so powerful. I'm glad I could help," she said softly, her voice steady but humble. He gestured toward the briefcase and the printed document on the table. "Most people wouldn't even notice that small detail, but you did. How did you learn to see things like this?" She took a deep breath, thinking carefully before answering. "I used to study business for a few years," she said. "One of my classes focused on branding and marketing. We learned how every small detail in a logo, color, or design sends a message. I guess I just remembered what I learned." The CEO nodded, intrigued. "And you noticed this even while working here serving tables?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I try to pay attention. I like noticing small things. It helps me understand more about how companies work." He studied her for a moment. There was no arrogance in her tone. She wasn't trying to impress him or anyone else at the table. She was simply sharing something she cared about. That sincerity struck him more than her knowledge alone. "I have to say," he continued, "it's rare to meet someone who can do their job so well and still notice things most people overlook. Most people in my office wouldn't have seen the difference." The waitress smiled politely. "Sometimes you just have to look carefully." He leaned back in his chair, thinking. The people at his table had started talking again, but he was only half listening. His mind kept returning to her words, her calm confidence, and her attention to detail. He realized that he had underestimated her. He had assumed she was just another waitress, someone who delivered orders and smiled politely. But she had intelligence and insight that had surprised him. "You know," he said slowly, "it takes courage to speak up, especially when you're not expected to know about something. Many people would have stayed silent, thinking it wasn't their place." The waitress's cheeks colored slightly. "I just thought it was something worth mentioning," she said softly. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." "You didn't," he said quickly. "In fact, you showed something very important. How paying attention and speaking with confidence can make a difference." She looked down for a moment, then back up at him, curious. "Do you really mean that?" "Yes," he said firmly. "I do." Her eyes widened slightly. Recognition from him, a person she had only seen on news and business reports, was unexpected. She had never imagined someone in his position would take her words seriously. The thought made her heart race slightly, but she stayed composed. He leaned forward again. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you still study business and branding in your free time?" "Yes," she said. "Whenever I can. I read articles, sometimes books. I like learning about how companies grow and how they connect with people. The CEO nodded slowly. That's impressive. Most people working in restaurants wouldn't have that interest or the patience to follow it. You do, and it shows. A colleague at the table, who had been watching silently, smiled. She's right, the colleague said. That takes dedication. The waitress gave a polite nod. I just try to make the most of my time and learn when I can, she said. Even if I'm working here, it doesn't mean I have to stop learning. The CEO felt a sense of respect growing inside him. She wasn't asking for recognition. She wasn't expecting anything in return. She simply cared about what she was interested in, and she noticed things others didn't. That kind of attitude, he realized, was rare. I have to admit, he said, I misjudged you earlier. I laughed at your comment without thinking. But now I see it was completely wrong of me. The waitress shook her head gently. It's okay, she said softly. I understand. No, he said, his voice firmer this time. It's not okay. You deserve respect for noticing that detail and speaking up. Most people would have stayed quiet. But you didn't. That says a lot about you. She looked at him, a mix of surprise and appreciation on her face. Thank you, she said quietly. That means a lot coming from you. He smiled slightly. You're welcome. I hope you continue noticing these things. It's a skill that will take you far. She nodded, feeling encouraged. For the first time that evening, she felt that someone in a position of power truly understood her potential. It wasn't about a job or a paycheck. It was about recognizing skill, attention, and confidence. Another moment passed in silence. The restaurant was busy around them, but at that table the atmosphere had changed. The CEO had moved from mockery to respect, and the waitress had moved from nervousness to quiet pride. Before you go, he said, I'd like to ask you one more thing. Yes, she replied, curious. What do you want to do in the future? He asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. It wasn't the usual polite small talk. It was genuine interest. He wanted to know her goals, her dreams, and what she hoped to achieve. The waitress paused, thinking carefully. She had never been asked this by anyone like him. Most people assumed she would continue working at the restaurant. But now, she had a chance to speak about her ambitions. I want to work in marketing someday, she said softly. I want to help companies tell their story and connect with people. I hope to go back to school and learn more. But for now, I'm doing my best here. The CEO nodded thoughtfully. That's a great goal, he said, and I believe you can achieve it. Her eyes widened slightly, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Recognition from him, someone who had built a massive company, was rare and unexpected. I'd like to help you, he continued. If you ever need guidance or advice, I want you to know my door is open. She felt her heart lift. It wasn't a promise of a job or money, but it was far more valuable. A recognition that someone believed in her potential. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but sincere. I won't forget that. The CEO smiled. I know you won't. You've already shown that you pay attention and take initiative. Those qualities will take you far. She nodded again, feeling a mix of pride and hope. For the first time that evening, she realized that a simple act, paying attention and speaking up, could open unexpected doors. With a final polite nod, she returned to her duties, moving through the busy restaurant with her tray. But the conversation at the table had changed the atmosphere. The CEO's colleagues were impressed, not only by her observation but by the way she carried herself. And the CEO himself felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had discovered someone with intelligence, curiosity, and determination in the most unexpected place. The night continued, filled with orders, meals, and conversations. But in the minds of both the CEO and the waitress, something subtle had shifted. Respect had replaced mockery, and recognition had replaced doubt. One small moment, one careful observation, had changed everything for both of them. And in that crowded restaurant, amid the clatter of dishes and the hum of voices, a quiet lesson about talent, confidence, and attention to detail had quietly unfolded. The restaurant was winding down as the night moved closer to closing time. The bright chatter of guests had softened into quiet conversations, and the smell of food lingered warmly through the air. Servers moved efficiently, clearing empty plates and offering final refills. The atmosphere was calmer, yet still full of life. The CEO at the corner table leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. The moment with the waitress earlier had lingered in his mind. He had expected a simple, polite comment from a server, but instead he had found insight, confidence, and curiosity. Something about the way she had noticed the logo difference had stayed with him. It was rare to see such observation in someone who was not formally in the business world. He glanced across the restaurant and saw her assisting another table. She carried herself with care and focus, smiling politely while listening to a guest's request. It was ordinary for her, yet to him it had become extraordinary. He realized that someone with her mindset, attention to detail, and calm confidence could achieve anything if given the right guidance. He motioned quietly to one of his colleagues. "Wait a minute," he said. "I want to speak with her again." The colleague looked surprised but nodded. The CEO stood and walked calmly toward her as she placed a tray of drinks on another table. She noticed him approaching and straightened slightly, maintaining her polite composure. "Excuse me," he said gently, catching her attention. "Could you come over for a moment?" She paused and approached, holding her notepad in her hand. Her heart beat slightly faster. She had already been recognized once for noticing the logo, but this felt different. "Yes?" she asked politely. He gestured toward the table. "I want to thank you properly for what you shared earlier about the logo. You were right, and most people wouldn't have noticed." Her eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and modest pride. I'm glad I could help," she said softly. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "I mean it. It's rare to see someone notice such small details and speak up with confidence. That shows intelligence and awareness." She looked down briefly, feeling shy but honored. Then she met his gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly. He smiled, then leaned in slightly. "I want to know more about you. What do you hope to do in the future? What are your goals?" The question caught her off guard. Most people only asked about her job at the restaurant, not her ambitions. She thought carefully before answering. "I hope to work in marketing someday," she said softly. "I want to help companies tell their stories and connect with people. I hope to go back to school and learn more about branding and business." The CEO nodded, impressed. "That's a great goal, and you have the qualities to achieve it. You notice details, speak with clarity, and are willing to learn. Those are rare traits." Her eyes brightened slightly, encouraged by his words. "I try my best," she said quietly. "Even while working here, I try to learn as much as I can." He gestured toward the briefcase and the folder of documents he had checked earlier. "What you did tonight, something small but important, reminded me that talent can appear in unexpected places. I want to help you if you'll allow it." She looked at him, astonished. Recognition and opportunity from someone of his experience felt unreal. "Really?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "I can provide guidance, advice, and opportunities to help you grow in your field. I've met many people in my career, but someone with your mindset stands out." Her expression shifted from surprise to quiet determination. "I would appreciate that very much," she said sincerely. He smiled, giving her a small nod. "Good. I want you to know that paying attention, noticing small things, and having the courage to speak up can open doors. Tonight, you proved that." She felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in a long time. Working in the restaurant had been necessary for her, but she had always dreamed of more. For the first time, she saw a clear path forward. The CEO glanced around the table, then back at her. "I know it may seem unusual that I'm taking this interest, but I've learned to recognize talent wherever it appears. You've shown yours tonight." Her cheeks warmed slightly, and she nodded respectfully. "Thank you. I won't forget this." He gave a reassuring smile. "I know you won't. You've already shown initiative, observation, and humility. Those traits will take you far. A few of his colleagues had been quietly observing the interaction. They were impressed by the sincerity of the moment. What began as a simple acknowledgement of a small observation had grown into something more meaningful. It wasn't just about a logo. It was about recognizing potential, courage, and intelligence in someone who had been underestimated. The waitress, feeling encouraged, smiled gently. "I'll continue learning and working hard," she said softly. "I hope to make the most of every opportunity." The CEO nodded. "That's exactly the right attitude. Keep that mindset, and you'll accomplish more than you imagine." The restaurant was nearing closing time. Guests began leaving, and servers carried trays back to the kitchen. The waitress glanced toward the kitchen and back at the table. She knew she needed to continue her duties, but she felt inspired by the conversation. "Thank you again," she said politely. "I should get back to work." "Of course," he replied. "Just remember, keep noticing, keep learning, and never underestimate your own potential." She nodded, feeling a new sense of confidence. "I will," she said. As she moved back to her station, the CEO returned to his seat. He looked around at his colleagues and smiled quietly to himself. The evening had begun with laughter and mockery, but it ended with respect and recognition. One small observation had turned into a lesson for everyone at the table. For him, it was a reminder that intelligence and talent can appear in the most unexpected places. For her, it was a moment that changed her outlook on the future. The night continued with the quiet rhythm of the closing restaurant. Plates were cleared, tables were wiped down, and guests were thanked as they left. Yet, in the minds of the CEO and the waitress, a subtle shift had taken place. Respect had replaced mockery. Recognition had replaced doubt. And a single moment of observation and courage had created a connection that would influence both of their paths. Before leaving, the CEO made a small note to himself. Sometimes the smallest moments carry the greatest lessons. One comment, one observation, one person willing to speak up can reveal insight that changes everything. For the waitress, it was a turning point. She realized that her attention to detail, her quiet confidence, and her willingness to speak up had not gone unnoticed. Someone she had only seen from afar recognized her potential and offered guidance that could open doors she had only dreamed of. As the restaurant finally emptied, she returned to cleaning tables and organizing orders. Yet her steps were lighter. Her heart felt fuller. That night, she carried with her not only the routine of her job, but also the knowledge that her talents mattered. The CEO watched her from his corner table until the last guest left. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that an evening that began with a simple mistake of judgment had transformed into something meaningful. It was a rare reminder that opportunity, talent, and recognition often appear in unexpected forms, and that paying attention to them could change lives. When he finally stood to leave, he caught one last glance of the waitress. She smiled politely, and he nodded in return. That simple gesture carried weight for both of them. One small observation had led to respect. One act of attention had led to recognition. And one quiet moment in a busy restaurant had created the beginning of something bigger for both the CEO and the young woman who had dared to speak up. As they went their separate ways that night, both knew something important had happened. It was a lesson in noticing, listening, and valuing people for what they could offer, not for the roles they held or the places they worked. For everyone who witnessed the moment, and for those who would later hear the story, it became clear. Sometimes the smallest detail can lead to the biggest change, and the courage to speak up can open doors no one expected. And for the waitress, it was just the beginning. She had been seen, heard, and recognized. The path ahead was full of possibilities, and she now walked forward knowing that her attention, her learning, and her quiet confidence had the power to change her life. The restaurant lights dimmed, the doors closed, and the night came to an end. But in the minds of the CEO and the waitress, the story of that evening would stay with them forever. A reminder that respect, recognition, and opportunity often come when least expected, and that every small detail matters.